95% all writing about slavery is about the transatlantic slave trade. And I think that I'm not criticizing that at all. The problem is that we haven't had that much on the rest. So there are huge gaps in our knowledge of the non-transatlantic world. I mean, as I said, there are some CVs that I mentioned in India and Pakistan. In the Arab world, it's much more difficult to find out what's happening. There are people whose genetic ancestry would show that they have Africans in their DNA. But you know, there is no appetite to try to investigate this. For example, when the Saudis only ended enslavement officially in the 1960s, and the Omanis in the 1970s. And the Saudis have taken a very clear policy on slavery and their archives. They have closed them. You cannot investigate them. You can't go into the archives and find out what's happening. I mean, thank goodness, you know, you only have to go down to Kew to find out what we did, and you know, of course we should do that. But I'm afraid that there is far less evidence of it. In Morocco, there's a good example in this book, which is also, I shouldn't really suggest you get another person's book, but it's a very good book by Justin Marozzi, Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World, which is excellent. And he says how difficult it was to raise the issue in Morocco and how he was in an outright hostility when you started talking about these. So there's no encouragement to look at it. Some brave people have done work on this, but it is thin.
Okay, could the lady behind the person in the cardigan? Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Can you stand up? Because it's easier to hear you if you stand up.
Thank you for the talk. That was very, very interesting. Presumably, when Britain was involved in slave trade, it was officially sanctioned. The government approved what was going on. Is that still the case? Are there countries where it is legally recognised, maybe it's part of the tax system?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anywhere that does. I mean, Mauritania, and you're better informed about Mauritania than I am, but Mauritania sort of keeps saying that it has banned it, but never quite seems to get round to it. And it still exists, and everybody knows that there are slaves in Mauritania, and who they are, and how it happens. And, I mean, you have what are called white Arabs and black Arabs, and the black Arabs are black Mauritanians, and the black Mauritanians are generally slaves. They generally came from the south of the neighbouring countries. But it's not, I don't think there's anywhere that it is legal.
Can we have someone from this side? The gentleman in the royal blue shirt. Could you stand up when you ask your question, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The one word you didn't mention, and it may not be relevant to your talk, is the word reparations. And reparation considerations are directed at the European populations. It sort of sounded from your talk as though what you were saying was that slavery was justified by lots of other people practicing it, and that maybe reparations aren't relevant or necessary. Interesting to know what you think about it.
Again, excellent question. Sorry I didn't mention it. I think there are three things to say about it. First of all, that I take no stand on reparations. If people want to pay reparations, it's up to them. I mean, for example, the church has paid, I think, 100 million, or it's certainly going to pay a lot of money. Individuals in Britain have paid money. That's up to them. I take no stand on it. There are problems with reparations in as much as some of the sums which have been calculated by CARICOM, the Caribbean nations, would require 7.9 times the entire budget of the United States to pay. I mean, this is just never going to happen. So I don't know how one engages it. Some countries like, I think it is France, and was it Portugal, have actually said this is illegal, we will not do it. Britain hasn't taken that stand. You know, if Britain is going to pay, then surely we should ask, well, what about the Saudis? What about the Omanis? What about the Turks, the inheritors of the Ottomans? And the other part you then have to ask is, and this is something I also didn't mention, is that there was something like 30,000 British people, I'm talking about the British Isles, including Ireland, who were taken by the Barbary pirates to North Africa. They became slaves. And they were treated just as badly as anybody else was. The women were put in the harems, and white women were sold at a premium. The men were chained to the oars, and their lifespan was 3 or 4 months. I mean, they weren't even allowed to go to the side of the boat to defecate. I mean, they were living in filth, and they just died. And, you know, are we going to go and say to the Moroccans, excuse me, we'd like a bit of money for the people of, shall we say, Lou, or wherever they were? There were months in which fishermen could not put to sea along the south coast. And, I mean, this also brings up the other issue, which is that the National Trust, you may be aware, has done a whole series of research about the links between particular National Trust properties and slavery. And they certainly made a lot of money out of it. The families that were involved and handed them over, a lot of the money came from the slave trade, which is, and you know, personally I think that's fine. I have no problem with that. What they have not done is then to say, but hang on, have we looked at this family, which possibly the second or third son would have been in the Navy, and Britain put a naval operation off both the east coast of Africa and the west coast of Africa. In the west coast of Africa, 17,000 sailors died stopping slavery after 1807. So if you're going to say, well, this house, great house, was built on the slave trade in sugar, then shouldn't we say, well, the third son was also involved in the Navy and died trying to fight slavery? There's also the other factor, which is, let's say that you are along the Dorset coast. Your family probably worked on one of these great estates, but you may have also, your family may have also been taken to, shall we say, Morocco or Algeria as a slave, and they may have died there. Sometimes they were ransomed, mostly they were not. So if we're going to do a complete picture of the National Trust, sorry, I know this is not your question, then we should also look at the totality of that relationship between Britain and the slave trade. Yes, recognize that where the money was made, but also look at where the sacrifice was.
Okay, question in the front here. Could you stand up? Is it possible?
Sorry.
Thank you.
What is the good news, if any? It seems to me that attitudes to slavery, say in Africa, are part of a much wider mindset about freedoms, and that really slavery will never be totally got rid of until those change, if they will ever change.
I mean, you're right. One of the great problems with Africa is that there are very few examples of good governance and places in which people can have a say in their own futures. I mean, you know, the Paul Biya in Cameroon is now, I think I've forgotten what it is, the 5th iteration of his presidency. Eritrea, which I know well, President Isaias has run the country since 1970. So people have no freedom at all. And you know that, I mean, for example, in Eritrea there's forced conscription, and you can be in the military indefinitely. And that is why people flee to Britain. So slavery is only one element of this, but I agree with you. You know, the people of Africa in the end will have their say. I'm always optimistic about Africa because Africans are optimistic about Africa. And you know, my own home country of South Africa, is still a functioning democracy, although there are problems with it. But I mean, there are problems with everywhere. So we're not special with that.
Is there anyone at the back who wants to speak? Could you stand up, please? Yes. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, a possible modern parallel. You talked about the Fulani as raiders and slave traders. It seems to me that they have descendants in the Janjaweed in Darfur that became the rapid support forces and are still doing horrible things. That there does seem to be, to me, a possibility of a direct line between what the Fulani did and what is now happening and did happen in Darfur, has been for about the last 20 years.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there is a clear link between, because although the Janjaweed or the many forms now are situated mostly in Sudan, they also split into Chad, and they actually trace their origins back to Libya, because it was Colonel Gaddafi who organized a sort of pan-Arab army based in that area. And that's how they operate. I mean, and they treat Africans literally as slaves. I mean, I have visited parts of Sudan where the young, I worked with some local people, we worked with the men for a while, and I said to them, so what did you do during the war? Because there was a long civil war between the North and the South. And they said, we walked. I said, what do you mean you walked? I said, well, we had to leave. When we got to about 12, 13, if you were a boy, you had to leave the village because the Arabs would come and kill you. Because there was no, they saw you as either slaves or, their enemies. And where did you go, I said? He says, well, we went to Ethiopia. This is the equivalent of walking from London to Athens. They had nobody with them. Groups of 20, 30 boys would set off. They had nothing except, maybe a little bread for the first day. And then they had to live off the land. And they said this was normal. After the 30 that left, 20 would survive, and a couple were eaten by hyenas, some died of snake bite, and we got there, it was fine. And they hadn't even bothered. I'd worked with them for 6 days, they hadn't mentioned this to me. It was only when I asked them. And of course, what is really appalling now is that the RSF, which is the modern version of the Janjaweed, is involved in exactly the same things. They target Africans precisely because they are Africans. They will enslave people, and they are backed by the United Arab Emirates, which has a base in western Ethiopia. They fly things in through Somaliland, across there, sometimes from Uganda, and they operate across Sudan. And it's the most appalling war. We hardly ever get any coverage of it, sadly, but that's the reality. So you're absolutely right about the Janjaweed. It is still continuing to this day.
I would like to ask a question now. Is there any kind of conference of historians interested in African history, or do you ever meet people, exchange ideas with them, or publications?
Yes, there is, but not. Most people, as I said, 95% of the work is on transatlantic slavery.
Okay.
So there are some that work on other forms of slavery. Mostly it is around that.
But is there any space for African intellectuals to examine their own history, or are you saying that the politics of these states are so repressive that there isn't any African universities where there are schools of thought about their own interesting history?
No, there is. I mean, for example, the University of the Western Cape held a very good conference on Arab slavery a few years ago. I actually quote from it from my book about exactly all of these things. But I could hardly say that it is the major trend in African scholarship.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions? Lots more questions. Yes, the second row here.
my question's based on what I heard from a friend of mine who was an asylum seeker, who described how he's from Ethiopia, and he was captured at the border with Libya on his way here. From what he told me, it seems to me there's quite a sort of thriving trade in capturing migrants of various kinds along the Libyan border. But he was held to ransom and managed to get somebody to pay it for him, but gosh, there must be others who don't. I just wondered if there's any links between that and modern slavery in North Africa.
Yes. That is exactly what happens. I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's the people that I showed with their hands outside of their jail are exactly that. They're the people who couldn't pay the ransom, and they were then sold off at $500 a shot. But I mean, it's not that. I mean, just to give you, I mean, I hope you won't be offended if I tell you what actually happens. There are, in some places, Africans who flee from their country are taken, they're held in the desert in pits, and they will be given a phone and told to dial their uncle in Canada or their, whoever it is, their relative in France or Britain, and to make a phone call. And if the people don't cough up with the money, they will take plastic bags, they set them alight, and they will drip burning plastic onto the backs of those they held captive. And there are examples of women being held captive, being raped while they are on the phone to their families to extract the money. It's not surprising that the families pay up.
Okay, some more questions? Yes, please. This front row here. Could you stand up so that people in the back can hear?
I lived and worked in Mali for 3 or 4 years in the 1980s, and I perceived that there was some slave-like conditions going on, especially in the northwest area. And I asked the people about it, and they said, oh, and this was, for example, the Bella people in the Dogon area, and they said, they become members of our family. You know, they're absorbed into our lives. We don't sell them or capture them or anything. And I couldn't find out anything else about it. They would deny any knowledge of this practice as such, as a trade. So I just wondered if you have any knowledge or information about that. Thanks.
I mean, there is a good literature on Mali and slavery, and I go into it in a small way here, because I can't, of course, do everything. But I mean, it's not very difficult to understand this. You only have to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's the same, you know. In America, we loved our slaves. The slaves loved us, said the owners of the plantations. Well, do we believe them?
Okay, this gentleman here in the fourth row, could you stand up and
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I only wish it could have been heard by the very many people who still say, I don't understand why black people drone on about slavery that ended 200 years ago. After the end of transatlantic slavery, a significant number of people came back to West Africa, of course, particularly to Liberia and to Freetown in Sierra Leone. Do we know anything about what sort of impact that had and the stories they brought back with them and so on? Did it make much difference to other people in West Africa?
It's a huge issue. There are many issues involved in this whole subject. But when slavery was banned, then there were attempts to either return people to places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and other places along Africa. And the British, for example, in the naval fleet, who would capture, and they captured something like 150,000, or freed 150,000 slaves on board ships, and that's just in the Atlantic. They freed fewer people, but also people in the Indian Ocean. The problem was they then didn't know what to do with them, so they took them to all sorts of places, including Cape Town, St. Helena. Some of them eventually got back to their home countries, but those were a tiny, tiny fraction of the total population. Because Britain didn't have the ability to work out where people came from, and even if they did, they didn't have a ferry service to take people home, if you see what I mean. In places like Liberia, it's very interesting, because there were 2 American organizations which tried to send African slaves back. There were people who were trying to help Africans to go home because they felt they'd had such a hard time of it. And there were other people who thought they'd get rid of black people. And there were 2 completely contrasting groups that both of them sent them home. The problem was when they arrived in the beginning, the Liberians welcomed them. And it was not a problem. But as they kept coming and the numbers grew, they became the elite of Liberia, the Americo-Liberians. Certainly when I was imported from Liberia, ran the place and spoke with the most peculiar accent. It was sort of West African Brooklyn accent, if you can imagine that. I can hardly understand the word. They were very repressive, and they dominated the entire society. But you'd have to go to each particular area and see how they were released. Britain also didn't just free people. They would, in a sense, because although the slavery was ended, indentured labour had not. So just as when the Irish were taken across to America, they had to work for 5, 6, 7 years to earn their passage, so the British freed people in the Cape, for example, and they worked for 6, 7 years as indentured labourers. They did eventually become free, but it did take a long time. So it's a very mixed picture.
Martin, we've been unbelievably privileged to hear such an excellent talk, and I'm sure you will be ready to talk to people informally when you try and sell some of your books. Martin will be at the back there with his books, and you can speak to him afterwards. And at the same time, please talk to Lisa Hayward about groups. Even if you don't want to volunteer, just talk to her about groups, because it's the lifeblood of our organisation. Martin, that was absolutely brilliant. I'd like to say your slides were excellent, really clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.